Then we're ready to begin. Good morning, everyone, and I'll call to order a special meeting of the Arkansas Public Employees Retirement System. And the news media was notified pursuant to Act 93 of 1967. And I recognize the presence of a quorum. I believe all the board members are in attendance, so thank you for your attendance this morning. And I would like to start off with our Executive Director. Duncan, if you would like to make a few remarks before we begin, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to welcome everyone to the meeting this morning. I wanted to remind everyone that, as in our previous meetings, we have Jacobia Twiggs from APERS who is hosting the meeting, so she'll help us navigate the muting of microphones and the various things that we need to navigate as we go through Zoom. I wanted to mention that, as the chair mentioned, we do have the press and the public here. At the last meeting, we had excellent attendance. If you look at the minutes, we have an extremely long list of members who attended the meeting. Once again, today we have, on our panelist side, 15 panelists, and we have over 40 attendees right now. So I think we've got, once again, excellent attendance from the public and from our membership. I wanted to mention today that, you know, what we're doing today is a follow-up from our last meeting. At the last meeting, we worked on our 2021 legislative package. We continued that discussion today. At the last meeting, we requested some feedback from our stakeholder group. So you'll see on the agenda, we have the Association of Counties, the Municipal League, and the State Employees Association here today. And when we get to that portion of the agenda, Jacobia will bring them into the discussion. I did want to mention, just from a goals perspective, just some thoughts about today. I think we've worked to, between the last meeting and this meeting, put together a set of packages to look at today. That's what GRS is going to go over with us. You know, I think a goal for today might be to take those 11 packages, try to narrow those down. I think in a perfect world, we might narrow them down to one. But, you know, it's more complex than that. So maybe we narrow them down to, you know, 2 or 3 different packages. You know, maybe we make some adjustments based on the feedback that we've received between the meetings. But, you know, I do think our goal is to, you know, continue to make progress, continue to narrow these things down so that if we come back at a July meeting, we can make a final decision on the legislative package. I did want to mention as well that, you know, once again, the legislature is going to have a series of town halls, or maybe just one remote town hall in the August and September timeframe. So once again, we're really working towards a package that at the end of the day, we'll take out, we'll talk to the members about, we'll get more feedback on. And so whatever we do here isn't the last stop. You know, it's just a step along the process as we work towards the 2021 legislative session. So those are just a few things that I wanted to say to kick it off. And thank you, Madam Chair, for that.
Yes, thank you, Duncan, for those remarks. And so we'll move on to the agenda. And the first item is an action item, and it is consideration of the minutes from the May 20th, 2020 meeting. And do I have
a motion, Madam Chair, that we approve the minutes as drafted?
I have a motion from Jason Brady to approve the minutes as drafted. Do I have a second? Second from Andrea. I have a motion and a second. Any discussion on the minutes? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And the motion carries. The next item have comment polls, which we're pleased to hear this morning, and they're going to comment on proposals being considered by the board. And the first person to comment will be Chris Valines from the Association of Arkansas Counties, and Jacobia is going to set Chris up so we can see him as a participant. So if we give just a minute to do that, that would be great.
Good morning.
Great. Good morning.
Morning.
Thank you for joining us.
It's good to see everybody this morning. Well, most of you. I see some of you still have your names up there instead. Must not have shaved or combed your hair this morning. I really appreciate you guys and Auditor Lee. Thank you so much. I lurk in the background of most of these meetings, and I watched the last meeting, and I really appreciate your ask that we and the Municipal League get engaged and come in and visit about our positions on the changes that are being considered by the board. You may not know this, but we have roughly 18,000 county employees in the state that are in the APERS system. And so it's undoubtedly the most valuable benefit that we offer to employees within county government. Unfortunately, we're woefully underpaid in county government. That's a systemic and long-term problem. But it's this benefit that helps us attract and retain good quality employees. And I want to thank all you guys, because you run along that line of balance between having a sound system and providing the benefits that help us do what we do. And I could lengthen the meeting by going through our positions on every one of the issues that y'all are looking at. I think the letter that we sent, I hope you all have had a chance to look at it. I think that letter helps identify where county government stands on these issues. And one of the biggest problems that we have is there are so many little specifics contained within the proposals that have yet to be identified that it makes it very difficult for us as a group to represent in a fair manner where we think the counties are going to rest on these issues. And so we've outlined some of the things that we think need to be determined. I will tell you the one issue that has given us more trouble in the past than anything, and this is with the 18,000 county employees and also a number of retirees, has been any change to the COLA. That seems to be something that's heavily relied upon when people join the system, when they get vested in the system, when they start targeting retirement dates, and when they get close to retirement, a lot of decisions are made based on that COLA. And then in retirement especially, their futures are determined by what they are expecting to receive. So in general, county officials and employees have a hard time with any changes to the COLA. The other three issues that are being presented, there's a spectrum of support or opposition with county employees. I will tell you it's far less opposition than you would get regarding the COLA. But I think if some of the variables on those are ironed out and we can take them back before our board, I work for a board of 18 people. And so I've got 18 people trying to represent the interests of 18,000, not dissimilar to what you guys are doing here. So as you can imagine, I've got a smaller board trying to gauge where 18,000 employees are. And sometimes they come back with what their recommendations are, but that doesn't mean that we're going to have 100% buy-in on anything out there. And so that's one of the issues that we deal with, and one of the reasons why we have to look at everything very closely. I hope that the letter outlines well enough that we don't have to get into the details of where we generally stand right now, but I stand ready to answer any questions that you all might have.
Thank you, Chris. Does the board have any questions for Chris? I think this is a great opportunity that we have him here with us to answer any questions that you might have.
Madam Chairman, it's Larry Walther.
Yes.
I've got a question.
Go ahead.
Hey, Chris, you and I have talked from time to time about these issues. Do you have a sense of urgency, as does this board, with regard to making some changes so that we can have a retirement system that we believe will stand the test of time
So, Secretary Walther, that's a really good question. I think that we all have some level of sense of urgency. I think you'll find in the letter, I used a metaphor that APERS is a lot like a cargo ship, not a jet ski. And so I think we have a sense of urgency that things need to happen to point things in a better direction. However, you have to balance that with an overreaction that points things in a direction that might get APERS back in the situation it was in the 90s, where it's actually overfunded and benefits have been cut to the point that we lose that attraction of APERS to get people employed. And, you know, I'll talk about one example of that is you all have been discussing the move from a 5% to a 6% contribution rate. And in the last session, that was going to be implemented 0.25% per year over a 4-year period. The discussions came up in the last meeting that it might move from a 5% to a 7% contribution rate, and that would be implemented potentially over a period of 2 years. Well, I think the urgency is there to make that positional change. I think, however, if we rush to making that change over a 2-year period, then what we're going to see is, and as you know, Secretary, all state employees have been denied a raise this year. What we're going to see is we're going to see people at the bottom end of our employment who can least afford going backwards, actually seeing take-home pay reduced by 0.5% next year. And so I think what we have to do is we have to moderate that change over time, make it a long-term vision for the program, and let our revenue sources locally and at the state catch up so that many of these people don't see that drastic a reduction in pay. Hopefully it can be absorbed by potential raises over time. That 7% move is in all likelihood the right one, especially when we consider ASHERS and ATRS both moving that direction. But the benefits of that, when you look at your actuarial reports, roll out over 10, 15, 20 years. And so you're not really seeing the benefit until that far out, the ultimate benefit. So why not slow down that progression towards that model? That's kind of the position we're in. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Madam Chair,
Yep. Mr. Brady, please.
may I ask Chris a question, please?
Go ahead, please.
So first, let me say, Chris, thank you definitely for the letter. I've got a bunch of highlighted items in your letter. The one class of employees that I'm struggling with that I have also from the SEA, and so I'm probably going to ask him as well, is not the new hires, but thinking through the timeline of this legislation's proposed in the fall, or excuse me, next spring. It wouldn't go active until summer or fall. And then APERS would probably need July 1 of 2022 to enact the legislation. So the question is, that 2-year gap of folks who could potentially be hired, what I'm struggling with is if the board looked at any changes to that group of employees, particularly maybe a COLA or FAC or years of investment, where would AAC take a stand on that? And please understand, your letter was great in pointing out that there's so many variables. It's really hard right now. So I almost feel bad about trying to put you on the spot a little bit, but if you could shed a little more light on that class group for me.
Jason, thank you for the question. I'm the director at the Association of Counties. I'm used to being put on the spot. It's not a problem.
Fair enough.
And so I think where you have to go with that issue is communication. And okay. One thing our group does very effectively is communicate changes to our membership. And so when you are making changes that are going to affect hires between, say, May of 2021 and implementation on July 1 of 2022, the key to that is going to be making sure that we communicate to those new hires what the changes are going to be. And so we're well prepared if any changes happen to be able to disseminate that to our groups, make sure that any hiring that's done is done with that caveat. Hey, your rate's going up. The vesting period is going up. What I don't want to do is get caught in a position where we're applying some of these retroactively to people, and no matter how good a communicator we are, when you come in expecting one thing, you get something different down the road as a result of these legislative actions. But great question, and we stand ready to work with you on that.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Anyone else? Thank you, Chris. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Madam Chair, before I go, I want to reiterate, I thank you guys so much for what you do. Judge Hudson and I are good friends. I watch the decisions that have to be made. I know they're difficult, and I have to compliment Duncan as your executive director and Jacobia. They do a great job representing you guys at APERS. So thank you again.
Thank you. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you. Bye, Chris.
Bye-bye.
Next up, we're going to have Mark Municipal League, and Jacoby, if you can plug Mark in, please, so
Okay.
we could have Mark from him.
Okay. Let me find him. Mark. And Mark. Okay, Mark, you're on. Wait a minute. You're muted. Okay, there you go.
There we go. Good morning. I'm glad I was finally able to connect. I had some pretty serious computer problems this morning. I wasn't able to do much of anything right up until 9 o'clock, and that's why I'm having to look down, because I only have one screen and my camera's way up there. I apologize for the technical deficiencies. I want to thank Duncan, and I want to thank the board for its incredibly hard work to try to reverse the course of some of the issues facing APERS. I know my membership very much appreciates a long-term view financially, and to echo Chris's comments, things don't turn on a dime. We know that, and we would like to see some long-term solutions as well. This is not an easy task by any stretch of the imagination. I get a lot of phone calls from members. I suspect you get a lot too. And as soon as you start talking about the concept of benefit changes, I'm sure your phones light up like a Christmas tree. So with that, my letter is pretty self-explanatory, I think, and it follows pretty much the same things that Chris's does. He and I have been in substantial contact over the last couple of months on these many issues facing the system. And we've talked to a lot of our membership. We've talked to our membership together. I actually attended his board meeting last week, which I thought vetted a lot of this very well. So I'm happy to stand for questions, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, as do the 500 cities and towns in this state. As I said in the letter, it's the largest percentage of population, so we're happy to be here and to answer whatever questions the board may have.
Do any of the board members have any questions for Mark? I think he submitted a very excellent letter to the board, and now's your opportunity to ask any questions.
This may be the first time in history that I've ever stood in front of a board and not had a single question.
Mark, this is David Hudson. Being
Hey,
an
Doug.
attorney, you have a perspective on the property rights aspect of benefit changes, which you brought up in the AAC board. You might want to just review that topic briefly from your perspective.
Be happy to. For those of you who don't know, prior to becoming the executive director, I was the general counsel at the league and litigated various constitutional measures, including property rights for many years. I have a pretty profound concern that anybody who's vested or on the drop or actually retired, and if there are deep or even frankly any substantial cut into benefits, there's a pretty substantial body of law out there across the country that says those folks would have a property right in those monies. That's what they relied on in doing their financial planning over time. And the result would be litigation, which I fear would be both time consuming and expensive. One of the things that was raised, and I think it's a really good point with regard to the final averaging calculation of either 3 as it currently is or 5 years as it's being talked about, or I think even somebody mentioned 6 at one meeting. There is some room for abuse there. I'd be the first one to admit that somebody came in and got an undeserved spike the last 1 or 2 years that really drove the benefit up. As I kind of worked through all this weekend and during my conversations with Chris, one thing that might be worth contemplating would be a sort of a semi-judicial committee within the board that could look at those things individually to make sure that abuse was addressed. There are some mechanisms in state law, as I recall, it's been a while since I've looked at them, that would allow statutorily for the board to have some of those authorities. And then if it was then you'd be litigating with one person on a benefit issue as opposed to a class action, which can, as all of you know, can be horribly expensive, and seldom does the class actually come out on top, but lawyers certainly do. So that's something to think about from a legislative perspective. And I'm sorry I didn't put that in my letter. That's one of those things that when I woke up at 2 o'clock this morning, sort of finally gelled in my head, and I made a note and then tried to go back to sleep. So I think that's a real possibility for you to consider, and it might cut back some of this concern. For the most part, I don't think people do that, but there certainly are individual cases where it's gone on.
Jason?
Madam Chair, thank you. Hey, Mark, again, appreciate you being a part of this. So in line sort of my question with AAC, and your comments really triggered my thought process. Again, that group maybe that hasn't been hired today, let's say they get hired July 1 of this year, but July 1 of 2022, they're not vested. They would still be 24 months out from, or 36 months from being vested. Your knowledge of the law, would the board, if the board was to make changes to that group and affect them, would that present problems legally, you think, in your opinion, from MLA's perspective?
I don't think it would, actually. If you're not vested, which is one of the reasons that I think somebody could correct me, I may be wrong about this, but my recollection is the original vesting period in APERS was 10 years. And then it was lowered to 5 at some point, and I couldn't tell you when. I didn't look at the legislative history. So I'm moving it from 5 to 7 to 10. If you're not vested, then you have a very minimal ability to argue that you relied upon a particular set of promises. Chris's point is spot on. One of the things that is critical in a property situation, a property rights situation, is notice and communications. We are very effective at that, and we are able to get those messages out cleanly and repeatedly so that the membership fully understands it. So I don't think that body of employees, that new group, would be legally affected. I think you probably stand on, I frankly think you stand on very solid ground for those changes. It's once the vesting starts that the real concerns begin. And of course, the deeper you go into it, the harder it becomes to argue to the contrary.
Madam Chair, follow up, please.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Mark, thank you for that. May I also then sort of, as I told Chris, I'm going to ask to put you a little bit on the spot then. Thinking in my mind, what would be a reasonable, I guess, line in the sand or cutoff if we looked at folks who maybe are new hires or folks who are already hired before this legislation kicks in? 30 months, which would be half of 5 years, is there a line that you think it's too close? Because that was also mentioned in AAC letter of, you know, what about folks who are right there on the cuspice of getting vested and we move the goal line? Any thoughts you could maybe share with the board of where you think would be a fair line in the sand?
Sure.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
And like Chris, we're used to being put on the spot, and when you do this enough, you're happy to answer whatever the questions may be, even though you might not. I might not want to, but I'm happy to do it. And I don't know that a bright line is really necessary, except for the vesting at the current 5-year mark. So the issue would become, I'm in, and I thought it was going to be 5 years. I mean, I hate to say this, but the case law that I've read and the kind of the way most property right issues are handled, if you don't actually have the right yet, the system or the entity that may be involved has the ability to move the goal line. So if you moved it to 10 and I'm at 4 years, I really don't think I've got much in the way of an argument to the contrary. Now, from a PR standpoint, and I am no good at that at all, that's a different issue, but we can certainly spread the word so that people who are in the system understand how it's going to work. And I'll add one thing there. And Chris and I have talked about this occasionally, and I've had this discussion with several city officials. One of the things that has, I think, been problematic for the system, somebody coming in and they've already got something under their belt. They've been somewhere, they've got it in the private sector or some other aspect of public service, and they've got some retirement benefit under their belt. And then they come to work in an APERS situation for 5 years. And while that may seem like a good idea to get some experience, the reality is, and I call it a death by 1,000 cuts, the more people that do that, the harder it is on the system. Everybody understands that the longer people stay in, the healthier the system gets, all things being equal. So I personally would like to see that practice at least slowed down a little bit, if not totally stopped. I don't think in this day and age, a 10-year vesting period is too much to ask. And if we want people to really invest in public service, which I think is a wonderful career, and I think it's something that we need to communicate to younger people that you can have a very meaningful career working for the state or a city or a county. I don't think 10 years is too much to ask. It might have to be explained a lot, but I don't think it's too much to ask.
Mark, thank you, sir. Appreciate that.
Yes,
thank you, Madam Chair.
Andrea?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mark, I hope all is well with you and your family. Isn't another aspect of the lawsuits you're talking about defining the word substantial?
It is.
Yeah.
And that's why I mentioned earlier that the deeper you go into people that are vested, there's certainly more of a quote unquote substantial right. Unfortunately, and there's really not a lot of Arkansas case law on this, but there is a lot in the employment arena as it relates to the property right itself. With that said, yes, that concept is out there. Not sure how it gets litigated, which is why I mentioned earlier, I think I'd rather take people on individually who think they've been wronged in some way.
Sure.
I would put it in class action.
And
divisions become very difficult when you start talking about thousands of people.
And you and I and your membership would agree that the goal in the APERS benefits was to attract people to public service and keep them on for 20, 25, 30 years. And that's the goal. And you're exactly right. Ones that just pop in, get a short vestment and pull out are are the ones that are not, I don't want to say helpful to the overall health of our, but it's not the ideal, and it wasn't the focus from my study of what a retirement system was to do. It was to give someone who vested their lives in public service. Anyway, I'm glad you're here. Thank you very much for your letter. Appreciate it.
I appreciate it, and thank you for asking about my family. As you know, it's been a difficult time, and I appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Any other board member have questions for Mark this morning? Well, Mark, thank you for joining us this morning. We appreciate it, and we welcome the comments. So we certainly thank you.
Thank you. Y'all have a wonderful day, and hopefully we get a little bit more rain, or at least my grass hopes we get a little bit more. Y'all take care. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, Mark, I'm gonna move you back.
The next item on the agenda, John Bridges with the Arkansas State Employees Association, and have a letter for John, but unfortunately he was not able to be here due to a family emergency situation. He has sent Erica G on his behalf, and since we do have the letter, Erica is here and available to answer any questions that the board may have for her. So Jacobia, I don't know if you're able to set up Erica or not, but
Yes, I'm gonna move her over.
that'd be great.
And she's there. Let me unmute her. Okay, Erica, you're here with us now.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you.
All right.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning on John's behalf. Do any of the board members have any questions with regard to John's letter? Jason?
Madam Chair, may I?
Please
Okay, I think we froze up here.
go ahead.
Okay. Hey, Erica, have you, Jason Brady, have you had a chance to watch the other questions I've asked?
Yes, sir.
So good morning to you. So you know what sort of to expect. The one area of your letter that left a little gray zone for me, and I would like to dig in, is that, again, as this board is looking at potentially moving benefits to folks from, let's say, July 1 of this year who get hired to July 1 of 2022, what would be sort of your position on those employees, and is there some sort of line that gets too close to their vesting that would make State Employees Association uncomfortable? Thoughts, please.
Well, I think the concept here that the State Employees Association, their board, has discussed, and that we tried to make clear in the letter that we provided you for the last meeting, is that the idea that many, or if not most, of the state employees decide whether or not to accept a position at the state based, at least in part, upon their retirement benefits. And you know, as Chris and Mark have pointed out, that the benefits that are available to public employee retirement can be a very big factor in making that decision. So our preference would be that any changes applied to new hires, so that that decision can be part of the decision of whether to take on that position, whether to accept that position with the state, as opposed to taking the position and then having the benefits change after you've already begun working. So certainly I do agree with Mark that from a legal perspective, I don't think that is a requirement. That it only applies to new hires, but that is the concept that we've talked about, and that is not so much a legal concept as it is, I'm not going to say PR, but I think it's one of perhaps employee morale, that that there wouldn't be too many changes happening once you've already begun working.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Jason. Other questions? Andrea, please.
It's been a long time since I've raised my hand to ask a question, but it seems the most logical thing on a Zoom. Erica, how are you? It's been forever since I've seen you in person.
I'm good. How are you?
Good, good. So the question I have is, do you guys spend any time, and I've been to a couple of your conferences, how much time do you spend educating people on our system as a whole? I would assume a fair amount, or do you, I mean, Duncan's come and spoke to you, or our previous executive director?
Yeah, certainly the last few years, it's something that ACA has gotten very engaged in trying to educate its membership and state employees as a whole, even those who are not members, about how APERS works and what to expect from it.
Okay. Okay. Again, thanks, John, for the letter. It was really clear, and we appreciated the input. Take care.
Well, he hated that he wasn't able to be here this morning, so thank you for letting me pinch hit.
Anyone else have any questions? If not, thank you, Erica. Thank you for joining us this morning. It's great to see you.
You too. Thank you so much.
I'm gonna move you back. Okay.
And we'll now move on to the next item of our agenda, and that's the presentation of actuarial information to continue preparation for the 2021 legislative session, and that is presented by Mita Drezeloff, David Hoffman, and Heidi Berry of GRS. And you all have the handouts that they have provided to us previously. So Mita or David, whoever wants to take it, if you will go ahead and proceed with your presentation. Duncan?
Madam Chair, and
Yes.
I may mention if, for anybody attending the meeting, they can go on our website and find these at apers.org, click the APERS board link, and then they'll find the agenda packet on the website if they need a copy of this as well.
Thank you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I think I'm going to, Duncan, if you don't mind, I'm going to share the screen and show the presentation.
That'd be perfect. Yeah.
Okay. So hopefully everyone can see the presentation on their screens. And as has been mentioned numerous times, that this is a continuation of the discussions that we've had in February, April, and May. There's been a lot of thoughtful discussion that has happened already. At the February meeting, we talked about the evolution of the unfunded accrued liability as of June 30th, 2019. At the April board meeting, there was some context provided regarding any benefit changes that the board may wish to pursue. And the board was presented with a preview of what the June 30th, 2020 valuation results may show, depending upon various market rates of return. Remember that there was a lot of uncertainty at that time of what the fiscal year was going to entail with respect to the market value return. As a result of the discussions in April, the board requested certain supplemental valuations to be presented at the May meeting, and we did that. And as a result of a presentation of those results, the board then followed up with Duncan. And let me just take this opportunity to thank Duncan, Carlos, and Jason for their assistance in helping put together this presentation and getting all of the information from the board to allow us to evaluate the packages that you're going to be seeing today. There were a total of 11 packages that were submitted from various board members. In addition to that, there was certain historical information about APERS investment return, inflation, and employer contribution rates that was requested to be presented by various board members. So here is basically a 20-year history of the market rate of return. You can see that between 2001 and 2010, after the, basically I'll call it the go-go years of the 80s and 90s, unfortunately the next 10 years were a pretty rude awakening, where on average the system only earned about 2.6% over that 10-year period, as opposed to the 8% assumption that was the actual assumption during those fiscal years. There's been a nice recovery in the next decade, 2011 through 2019, so that the 9-year average is 9.5% in comparison to the 9-year average of our assumption of 7.7%. And also remember that the board in the past few years has lowered their expectation of what investment return the system can expect to earn on an actuarial basis going forward. So initially it got reduced from 8 to 7.75, then to 7.5, and then to the current assumption of 7.15. Here is a table showing the change in the consumer price index over the last basically 19 years. And you can see that the 10-year average from 2001 to 2010 is about 2.37%. And for the last 9 years, it's about 1.74%. Some years, there have been years where it has been higher than 3%. So for example, 2001, 2006, and most recently, actually 2018. But you can see that in many years, the increase in the CPI has been less than the current 3% COLA provision. There was a request to show the employer contribution rates over the last 20 years. And remember that we had talked back in February that as a result of basically investment income falling short, it's pretty much fallen on the employer contribution rate. So back in the early 2000s, the employer contribution rate was 10%. It got up to about 12.54%. There was some recovery back in 2007 and just before the financial crisis that allowed it to drop back to 11. But after the financial crisis, it's pretty much been a one-way street with the employer contribution rate going up. So to basically 12.5% in 2009 to basically 13.5 and then 14.5 and the current employer contribution rate of 15.32%. And please, if there are any questions that the board may wish to ask, I'd be more than happy to take them at any time.
I just want to make a note on that last slide. Oh gosh, I almost called you Mita when I looked at your picture.
That's fine.
This is, people need to be reminded, I guess members, and I need to remind myself when I look at a chart like this, that money is being drawn from the general fund that their paychecks are coming out of as well. I mean, basically we're printing money. We're an unusual system in that we can raise that to help ourselves out, to help ourselves being the system out. We can raise that amount just by a vote of the board, which is, in my opinion, similar to being able to just print money. And it comes out of the employers, which is the general fund of the state of Arkansas. Anyway, I think that's always good to note that this isn't money that's just out there in the Netherlands.
Okay, thank you. So as I mentioned, as a result of the May 20th board meeting, a total of 11 supplemental valuation packages were requested by various board members. The benefit changes generally fell into the following categories. The member contribution rate changes for contributory members. And remember that the current provision is a 5% of payroll member contribution rate. One is a change to the final average compensation period. The current provision is a 3-year period. Most of the changes that we saw related to a 5-year period. I think there was one change where it was a 6-year period. There were some vesting period changes. The current provision of a 5-year period, there was some consideration to extending it to 8 and I think in 10 in some instances. as well as some proposed changes, the cost of living allowance provision. Now, there was a request to show how the requested changes to the cost of living provision would actually affect a member's benefit. So right now, the current provision is the 3% compound provision. So this table shows for an individual, a member who would have retired in June of 2010 with an initial computed benefit of $10,000, how that member's benefit would have increased over basically the period through 2019 or 2020, given the various provisions. So the 3% compound column there, it's basically, you know, the starting benefit 10,000 times 1.03, which gives 10,300, times 1.03 again, 10,609, and so forth, with a final benefit there of 13,439. If the provision in place would have been the lesser of 3% or CPI, that also shows the evolution. So for example, in the very first year, the change in CPI wasn't as high as 3%, it was 1.36%. So in that instance, the individual would have received a compound COLA based upon the 1.36% provision. So instead of receiving 10,300, they would have received 10,136. The very next year, the change in CPI was 4.06%. So they would have been capped at 3% in that instance, and that 10,136 would have been increased by 1.03% to get to the 10,440. Similarly, on the right, instead of a compound COLA, we're showing a simple COLA. So basically a simple COLA, the way to think about it on the 3% column is the annual COLA increase is $300. It's 3% of your base benefit. So the member retires with a computed benefit of $10,000. So each year they get an increase of $300. It doesn't compound, it just adds, and that's why we call that the simple COLA. On the situation where it was lesser of 3% or the change in the CPI, for example, in the very first year, the increase would have been 1.36%. So they would have got an increase of $136. In the following year, where the change in the CPI was 4.06%, that would have been capped at 3, so they got an increase of $300 from the 10,136 to the 10,436, excuse me. So you can see what the final amounts were for the various individuals. Obviously, the 3% compound COLA is the most generous. The 3% simple, at least in this example, would have been next, and then the lesser of 3% or CPI compound is always going to be a higher benefit for the member than a simple COLA. The board, in addition to the 4 categories we talked about, the board also had variations about which groups may or may not be affected by any of the legislative changes. So some provisions were to only apply to new hires. Some provisions were to apply to new hires and non-vested members. Some provisions were to apply to all active members. And some provisions were to apply to all non-retired members, excluding drop participants. So the board also had, even if they had a similar provision that they wanted to see evaluated, they may have applied it to a different class of the membership. The board, with respect to the member contribution rate changes, also had different phase-in periods. So there was a 2-year phase-in period, there was 4, I think there was a 5, and I think there was an 8 as well. So there's some differences there. And on these 2 slides here, you can see a summary of the packages that were asked by us to be evaluated. So package 1 was a 6.5% member contribution rate with the 2-year phase-in. And all of the member contribution rate, the groups affected were always all contributory members. For the FAC period, package 1 was a 6-year period. I believe every other package was a 5-year FAC period. Now, the way we evaluated that provision was we did have a hold harmless provision for if it applied to all active members. So for example, in package 2, for an active member, we computed their 3-year FAC and said, okay, then going forward, we'll compute your 5-year FAC. But if your 5-year FAC was less than your frozen 3-year FAC at the time of the benefit change, you got the benefit of that 3-year FAC. So we had the hold harmless provision when we did the FAC period changes when it had affected all active members. You can see that the vesting period was package 1, 10 years, package 2, 8 years, packages 3, 4, and 5 on this instance was a 5-year period, the current provision. The only package that we evaluated where the COLA did not change was package 1. It remained 3% compound, and that was for all members. The other COLA provisions that were evaluated was the lesser of 3% or CPI, which you can see in packages 2 through 5. In those instances, though, those only affected new hires. So these are packages 6 through 11. And 6 through 11 had a lot of the same provisions, similar provisions, as some of the other packages we've seen. It was either a 6 or a 7% member contribution rate, and either a 2 or a 4-year phase-in period. The FAC period got increased from 3 years to 5 years. The vesting period increased to 10 years. But for packages 6 through 11, there was a little bit of a nuance with respect to the COLA. And that was, it did not remain compound. On all of these packages, it got switched from a compound COLA to a simple COLA. In addition, packages 8, 9, 10, and 11 were the only packages that affected a broader portion of the membership. And that was all non-retired members excluding drop. And there's one thing to think about with respect to those packages 8 through 11. And that's covered in a little bit later slide, but it's something called rush to the door. And that's something we're going to talk about. But the board has seen this slide before. This was presented in the May presentation. So the first way we evaluated all of the packages was to say, okay, what if those packages were actually in place in the June 30th, 2019 valuation? And we presented it in different ways. So column A on the next slide would have been the decrease in the June 30th, 2019 amortization period if the board maintained an employer contribution rate of 15.32%. Column B is what the reduction in the computed employer contribution rate would have been if the board allowed for a reduction in the contribution rate. Either A or B could happen, not both. Column C represents the decrease in the unfunded actuarial accrued liability. And column D sort of shows the evolution of the reduction in the employer contribution rate if the benefit changes that were being evaluated only applied to new hires. And it shows what the reduction would be 5 years out, 10 years out, and then ultimate. So this slide here shows the results of the packages we were asked to evaluate. There are a lot of numbers there. I'm happy to answer any particular one. But obviously the more members that are covered, for example, packages 8 and 10, obviously the bigger the reduction in the unfunded accrued liability. And it's basically that's a no-brainer. But the ones that do affect more of the membership, and that's that rush to the door concept. And that's something that the board will want to think about if packages 8 through 11 do have some consideration. And what rush to the door means is, since that provision affects all non-retired excluding drop participants, the membership has an incentive to retire sooner than they otherwise would have to be covered under the 3% compound COLA provision. So some of the savings that you thought you were going to get gets offset by the fact that people, i.e., rush to the door. They retire sooner than they otherwise would have because they want to be covered under the 3% compound COLA provision. And we've seen that happen in other systems where groups like that were affected. So for the purposes of the results of packages 8 through 11, it was assumed that expected retirements would be 25% higher over the 3 years following the June 30th valuation date. And there's no magic there with respect to the 3 years. It was just something that there's no right number, but depending upon how long it would take to implement the benefit, we thought that was a reasonable thing to do. And that those retirements would not be covered under the new COLA provisions. So remember that we also looked at 15-year projections of the unfunded accrued liability, the funded ratio, and the computed employer contribution rates, and the computed amortization periods. I'm not intending to go through all of the slides, but I just want the board to remember that it was assumed that the proposed benefit changes would be effective as of June 30th, 2022. All of the projections were based upon the -5% market value return scenario for fiscal year 2020. I think right now, if memory serves, we might be doing a little bit better than that, given where the market has went over the past couple of months, which is very encouraging news. But to be consistent with what the board has seen in the April and May presentations, we thought we shouldn't switch this one because that's what the board has seen. For the COLA changes, the July 1st, 2022 COLA is the first COLA assumed to be effective. Now, in the past, the board has actually seen 15 years worth of numbers there, but we wanted the board to be able to see the packages on all of these slides. So you can see the provisions towards the top of each of the tables. The thing you'll notice is we've showed annual results for the periods ending June 30th, 2020 through 2024. But then the following two rows are 5 years later. So then you see June 30th, 2029, and then June 30th, 2034, so that there's no confusion from the board there. I was not planning on going through all of the results of the packages. The board has had, I believe, the presentation for a few days now, but I would be happy to answer any questions that the board may have with respect to any of the packages. The final thing I'll say is, and this goes back to what we have said before, there really is no right answer as to what legislative changes should or should not be pursued. We've heard very eloquently from the membership, the three individuals that spoke this morning. So you have member feedback. The board, I think, has a lot of common ground on changes that came through in the 11 packages. For example, I think each and every one of the packages had an increase in the member contribution rate. There's a lot of discussion whether there should be a 2, a 4, an 8-year phase-in period, and that's open for board discussion. The majority of the packages, I think every one of the packages had to change to the FAC period. So there's a lot of common ground there amongst the board. The vesting period, there is some common ground, but I think there's some thought about extending it. The other thing I'll mention there is extending the vesting period and increasing the member contribution rate sort of have an offsetting effect. And what I mean by that is if you increase the member contribution rate, for example, let's say it goes up to 7%. Well, increasing the vesting period really doesn't help very much. The reason being is most members now, given that the member contribution rate is so high, or higher, I don't want to say so high, but higher, they're going to take a refund of their contributions. So increasing the member contribution rate to 7, but extending the vesting period to 8 or 10 years sort of have a neutralizing effect. So that might be something that the board may want to consider when you're looking at those two provisions. And which membership groups should or should not be covered. I think there were very good points made on some of the issues there. And with that, we'll be happy to take any questions the board may have.
Madam Chairman?
Yes, Daryl, go ahead.
Expound on that. You said that increasing the vesting periods will I want you to expand on that last statement.
Sure.
You said they will take a refund of their, what do you mean by that?
So if we increase right now, the vesting period is 5 years and our member contribution rate is 5%. So if I'm an individual with 7 or 8 years of service, I've been contributing to the retirement system 5% of my pay over that 7 or 8 year period. I now have to take into consideration what's more valuable to me. The member contributions that I've made over that 7 to 8 year period, which were based upon the 5% of pay member contribution rate, or waiting perhaps 20 to 25 years to take a vested deferred benefit. Because in many instances, our member may terminate at age 30 or 35 and take that deferred vested benefit at age 65. If we increase the member contribution rate to 7%, then obviously their account balance is going to be higher by 7/5. You know, it's just they're contributing 7% of pay instead of the 5% of pay. So the value of their account balance obviously goes up because of that, such that even if we didn't extend the vesting period, we might have a situation where more members are going to take a refund of their contributions just because of that, because their account balances were higher if the board decided to increase the member contribution rate, for example, to 7%.
Madam Chair.
That is a very lucid explanation, and you have cleared it up for me. I understand that. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Jason?
Madam Chair, to follow up on that question though, an employee does not become vested. What happens to the employer, the state's contribution to the program? It's not refunded back to the state. Does it not remain, the funds remain within the system?
The funds remain within the system, no matter if the vesting period is a 5-year period or a 10-year period.
So the state's contribution would remain within the system, even though the employee might take their 5% back or 7% or 6%.
Exactly correct. And then that goes to help finance the benefits of the longer service employees. So that's a very true statement.
All right. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Madam Chair.
Yes, go ahead, Jason.
I do apologize. I had this set aside. May I ask you to go all the way back, and if you wouldn't mind, maybe even putting back on the slides 6, the slide on page 6 and the slide on page 7. So my first question to you is, reading through this, obviously I saw the averages and that's excellent. Can you tell me the effect to the program of years when we have negative rates, like in 2012, we went 0.4, or 2015 when we go, 2016, we go 0.01. What is the effects on the overall funding of the system in years where we actually go negative, from your perspective and review of our numbers?
I'll answer that question, but I think there's a follow-up answer that's necessary.
Okay.
Because remember that our target isn't 0. our target is the number to the rate. So we were, for example, in 2012, we were expecting to earn 8%. We earned negative 0.4. So we fell short by 8.4%. So for example, if that would have happened this year, that would have increased our unfunded accrued liability by about $650 to $700 million. That's what that means. Now that's also true even if you have a positive return, but it's less than the assumption. So for example, in 2015, even though that 2.2% was positive, we still were short of our target. Our target was 7.75, so short by about 5.5%. So that also increased our unfunded accrued liability. If that would have happened this year, that would have been about a $400 million increase in our unfunded accrued liability. So it's not, the barometer isn't zero. Now, obviously, negative returns are going to be even worse than positive returns. But the bogey isn't zero. It's that right-hand column. It's the 5%.
So
is the 8% or the 7.75 and so forth. 7.1.
Sure. So the flip side of that is, and yes, I do hope to retire one day in this system. So what about 2011 when you have 3 times what our target was, or 2014 when you have 2.5%? Does that offset the negative or the years where we don't quite hit our target, or how does that affect the system? Because it's a two-sided coin.
And the answer to that is no, it doesn't offset it. So think about it in this fashion. Let's say we start off with $100 and we first have a negative 50% return. So now we have $50 and now we have a positive 50% return. You don't get back to 100. You only get back to 75 because 50% on the positive side is $25. So the negative 50 and positive 50 do not offset each other because of that compounding.
Okay. Madam Chair, with your indulgence, if I may, please.
Please go ahead.
Thank you, ma'am. Could we go to the slide on page 7, please? And I guess my reaction to this is I was observing the 2 decades, and from 2001 to 2010, I noticed that we had 5 years under 3% CPI, one that was actually negative and only 4+. And then in this decade that we're in, 2011, we had 6 years under 3% CPI, one negative and only 2 above. Looking at in the long term, general comments about that as far as how it affects not only the retirement system, but how it affects, I guess, the individual members that you can share with us. Any thoughts on that?
Well, let me first start with how it affects the system.
Yes, please.
If we believe that part of inflation ties into investment returns, so for example, fixed income returns and equity returns and things of that nature, obviously the lower inflation translates into lower investment returns for the system. For the membership, with the 3% compound COLA, if the increases in CPI are less than the 3% compound COLA, then if CPI-W is a reasonable representation of price increases for a retiree population, and there's debate about that, because remember CPI-W takes into account the entire basically population, or let me say inactives and retirees, then the individual's purchasing power increases during the period of their retirement. They're receiving COLA increases more than sufficient, then is necessary to at least offset the increase in consumer price indices, at least as measured by CPI-W. So that is the effect. Now, what you have to take into consideration is what you've heard so far, and that is individuals have already retired and perhaps have made decisions based upon the current benefit provisions. So that is a very, it's a very important point to consider. Not saying that things should happen one way or the other, but it's very difficult for a current retiree to alter their planning as opposed to, say, a new hire. And I would suggest that consideration may want to be made if you were designing a new Arkansas Public Employee Retirement System plan today, going forward. Let's say it just didn't exist. What COLA provision would you actually want to include as the appropriate benefit provision? And that's just something for the board's consideration.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Other questions?
I have a comment, a question.
Judge Hudson, go ahead.
First of all, outstanding work. These presentations that you've been doing, I think, are informative and they're very helpful, not only to the board, but to anybody that is interested in observing our discussion now and is concerned about the retirement system. I was looking back through my notes from January 17, 2018, when we had a joint education session. We had the members of the retirement committee that chose to come, the board and the staff there. We had presentations from Cal and from GRS. It happened to snow that day, so some of the attendance was down. But I took a lot of notes, and one of the presentations, I think it was GRS, made, they looked at the long-term solution to the percentage of active members and the payroll. And there was a chart, and they reported, and that would have been in January 17, 2018, that the payouts that at that point from the system were 30% of our assets. The contributions, being from employers and employees, were 19%, because some of the employees are non-contributory. And so when you take the difference between the amount paid out percentage-wise and the contributions, there was a difference of 11%. So then you could look at that 11% and your earnings, and did that make that up? If not, then it's a liability. And so the unfunded accrued actuarial liability has been the big issue. I thought that percentage was simple. It was more clear, perhaps, than some other examples. And I don't remember if you were there and made that, or if that was one of your partners, but I would point that out as far as clarity on how much money is going out percentage-wise from our assets, and how much money is being contributed from the sources, and then what we're earning, and the challenge. And in that regard, I would ask you this question. What is a reasonable or a prudent time frame for us to reduce the unfunded accrued actuarial liability? How do we approach that? Do we approach that by reducing the amortization period to keep the unfunded accrued actuarial liability from increasing? Or do we reduce both the liability and the amortization period? What is it? We have the prudent investor rule legislated. What guidelines should we adopt? What is your feedback on that question?
Well, the prudent investor rule, I don't think applies to the actuarial funding policy. I think that's how you're supposed to invest the assets. I think and I'm not by no stretch of the imagination an expert on fiduciary responsibility on the investment side, but I think the prudent investor rule has more to do with the investment policy than the actuarial funding policy. With respect to what the board should consider in trying to reduce that unfunded actuarial accrued liability, you've brought up some very good points and questions, Judge Hudson. And I think the best way I can say it is there are trade-offs. That in a perfect world, would we like to see the amortization period at 17 years or less? I think the answer is yes, but we don't live in a perfect world. And if that meant that there had to be severe benefit cuts to achieve that, then I do think there's more flexibility in that amortization period than in a perfect world, because we don't live in a perfect world. We are at the mercy of, and we've said this before, we are at the mercy of the markets. And it would be unfortunate if, let's say, more severe benefit reductions were made, and let's say investment returns really, went through the roof or whatever the case may be, and now we're at an amortization period of 4 or 5 years. So, and I think we've heard this before, you don't want to overreact, but there are certain actuarial considerations, and we've talked about this negative amortization. In a perfect world, would we like to see the unfunded accrued liability decrease in nominal terms? I think the answer is yes. But does it have to? And I think the answer is no. We talked about certain things that the board, this gives us more flexibility. What it doesn't do is guarantee anything, because the board, through a very thoughtful process, is going to come up with a legislative package. And remember that these considerations or these discussions happened before COVID-19. It was before the pandemic. And that threw another monkey wrench where, back in February and March, the sky was falling. But then April through June, there was a very nice recovery. So to make decisions on benefit provisions that affect our membership based solely on short-term actuarial numbers, I would suggest the board might want to not go down that path.
Thank you. I would also comment on Larry's sense of urgency. I think that defining the sense of urgency to take action is a concept that we all share. It's going to be the application of that, and I think the input that we've gotten from the associations has been helpful, and hopefully with the amount of work that's been put forth here, we can identify common ground. There might not be all of the components in any one of these 11 packages that we prefer, but perhaps we can identify pieces of each one that we prefer and get down to the 2 or 3 to consider, hopefully in a July another special meeting.
Madam Chairman?
Yes, Gary, go ahead.
I agree. But I think the work that's been done here is very helpful, and I've read through those. And I appreciate also the comments we've heard today from the different organizations. And it helped me to realize that there are three things: legal aspects, public relations aspects, and employee morale that we need to take into account as we think of all these things. And I'm all for reducing the unfunded liability as much as possible and as quickly as possible. But I do think we have to consider those factors and the legislative reality of what someone said last meeting, what would a legislator actually take up for a vote? So I just want to go ahead and say that reading through all of these, the one that I am leaning toward is scenario number 2. The COLA provision, I don't think we could expect any support for anything other than a COLA change for new hires. The changing to 7%, I think, should be stretched out for a long time because of employee morale, and with the meager raises that they've been seeing and increases in health insurance, it is, as someone said earlier, it's possible that an employee could have less pay this year than last year if all of these things hit at the same time. The 5-year averaging, I think, is good for salaries, especially with what GRS is proposing with the 3-year lock on the 3-year average, and then look at the 5-year beyond that. And the 8-year vesting, I think, is a kind of a compromise. I personally am okay with just keeping the vesting at 5 years. I understand the argument that the Municipal League made about the slow bleeding and the mini cuts. That was a good argument of people who are just getting into the system, working 5 years and being able to take out some retirement. So I'm okay with the idea of stretching that out. And I think scenario 2 suggests an 8-year vesting period, which I see as kind of a compromise there. So there you go. I just thought I'd go ahead and throw that out. And we've had some really good discussions for several months. So I'm at peace about kind of declaring where I am leaning, or where I'm my thoughts on these different scenarios. And again, I want to appreciate the good work that our staff and GRS have done to help simplify all this for us. So thank you.
Thank you, Gary, for that comment on package number 2. Does anybody else have any questions about that, or any comments about package number 2, or any other package that you might want to talk about?
Madam Chairman, this is Daryl Bassett. I can only kind of echo what I've heard, but obviously reducing our unfunded liability is a priority for me. I mean, with a $2.3 billion unfunded liability, that is something that really, I think, commands our attention. But I think we need to be cautious in our approach with regard to how we handle that. I think with regard to the vesting periods, I think if we look at this as a knee-jerk reaction, and we look at the which would be the ideal amortization period of 17 years, I think that's unrealistic. I think that's what you're looking at in a perfect world, and I don't think that. I think if we're looking at where the market is right now, and where we've seen the market move just over the last several months, we've seen 401ks go into the negative, and now they're in the positive. And so I don't think that we can look short term. I think we have to look long term in that area. And so that would be my comment based on what I've heard so far.
Madam Chairman.
Andrea, go ahead.
Thank you. Something else to consider is one of the reasons state employees were not able to get raises. The Governor Hutchinson said is they're looking at the budget as a whole, and therefore something that's important to me is as well as being at 80% funded is the employer contribution, since it comes out of the same pot as the raises. And I think I just would throw that out there. Mr. Carnahan, I think package 2 is reasonable. I would agree with you. I made a kind of a summary sheet of what appears to be something we all, when I look at all the packages that comes about, and that is raising the contribution rate to 7% over 4 or more years. From the common ground of all the different packages, it's kind of fun seeing everyone's package and not knowing whose was whose. As a matter of fact, when I read them, I had to question which one was mine, which one I asked about. But it appears we all agree, or the majority of us agree on 7% brought in at a slow rate for 4 or more years. It appears we're all pretty comfortable with changing the FAC to 5 or more years for non-vested and new hires. And I think that covers our, that covers what Mr. Hayes shared, which is, hey, when someone gets vested, it starts getting dicey as to what you can or can't do. And then going to the vesting period, it appears that we're all good with 5 or more years there, again, for non-vested or new hires. And the COLA, you know, I agree with Judge Hudson. I think that's obviously the least palatable for anyone currently in the system. It does seem to have a big impact financially, however. So it seems like going to simple for everyone that's non-vested, and then the CPI 3% for new hires. But those are the common grounds I found. And of course, none of these totally fit into that. I think packages 7, 9, 11 come fairly close, but after all the work we've done, I agree with what others have said. I think we're coming really close to coming up with a package that addresses the unfunded liability, that addresses not wanting to throw too much at any employee, and yet bringing us up with what the other systems are doing. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Andrea. Other comments from anyone?
Madam Chairman, I just would echo what Ms. Lee had just said. Not only does it bring us in line with, I think, with what other systems are doing, but I think I think where we're getting to is very close to what makes sense for our system. And I think that's what this meeting is really all about, is what makes sense for APERS. It's not about teachers. It's not about any of the other systems. It's what makes sense for APERS. And I think we're getting close to that. And I think the comments that have so far been voiced are all going in that direction. And I think that's welcomed. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Daryl.
Madam Chair,
Yes, Jason, go ahead.
if I may, please. Looking at package 2, I definitely agree phasing in. I think that would work. 5 years, all actives, I guess I'd take a little exception to the word all actives. I'm assuming that would be new hires and non-vested, because just throwing that out.
Okay.
8 years new
Can I chime
hire.
in there?
Oh, sure.
Yep. So let's clear what all actives means. That
Yes,
truly
please.
means all active members, but it has a hold harmless provision. So your 3-year FAC would be computed at the time of the legislative change. But then going forward, you would have a 5-year FAC computed. You would get the higher of the two. So in package where it says 5 years for all active members, it truly is all active members. People that are participating in the drop, they've already had their FAC computed because they're in the drop and their benefits already established. But it also has that hold harmless provision where you would have a 3-year FAC computed at the time of the benefit change. But then going forward, as you earn more salaries, you would then have a 5-year FAC computed. You would get the higher of the two. You would get the higher of the 3-year frozen FAC or the new 5-year FAC that would take into account salaries earned after the benefit change. So I just wanted to clarify that point.
And that's part of the reason why I was asking all the participants today about what is a line in the sand of those folks not vested. So I do want to throw that ingredient on the counter in the soup for everyone's concern. And this is maybe more personal for me or from my perspective in employment and state government, the 8 years for new hire for vesting. The only thought I will pass on is I was fortunate to serve a governor. He was in office for 10.5 years, but you do have those who serve and they only get 8 years. And I do wonder if it maybe shouldn't be considered for 7 years, just because you'll have some folks who may not by a few days be able to get 8 years in that, or for elected officials who may want to run and maybe don't want to serve, maybe don't get the second term or complete the second term. That's just a thought. And then my final item is, and again, I go back to my question to everyone, to Mark and Chris and everyone, of where is that fine line between now, let's say July 1 of this year to July 1 of 2022, what is that fine line about those not vested that have just got into the system as far as the COLA and how that affects them? So I don't know that I have a resolution to propose, but I do wonder if that shouldn't be considered by this board, because that's 2 to 3 years away, and that's 2 to 3 years of employees that affect the system 20 and 30 years down the road. So don't know that I have a solution. I just add that comment.
Thank you, Jason. Other comments, additional comments? Anyone?
Yeah, Madam Chair, Andrea here.
Andrea, go ahead.
Oh, whoops, I stopped my video there. One of the questions I asked of Duncan a while back, because it's been thrown out a little bit, is non-contributory active members versus contributory active members. I was contacted by state employees who said, well, how about those that aren't contributing anymore or haven't, and so I asked Duncan for a breakdown, and you guys can't see my screen, but we have 36,475 active members that are contributory and 8,804 that are currently non-contributory. 36,475 contributory, 8,804 non-contributory. That's our active members. That's not our retired members. Our retired members, of course, the far majority of them were non-contributory because that's how the system was for years back then. But anyway, I just wanted to throw that piece of information in here. To me, the non-contributory members are I don't think are that much of a strain on the system. So I told the state employees that contacted me that, they're slowly being phased out anyway. So I just thought I'd share those numbers with you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Andrea, for making that point.
Madam Chair, this is Dale Douthit.
Comments, question?
From Mr. Dreslow.
Go ahead.
Mr. Dreslow, I'm looking at packages 2 and 7, and when I look down at the other charts there, and it shows the amount of funded liabilities that we would have. Both of them come in around 80% in that last category in 2034. Can you tell me what makes those end up the same as far as the funded liability? There's got to be something in package 2 that is, because I look at the COLA, talks about a compound, and in package 7, the COLA is simple. What's getting us to the same bottom line there? Because package 2 seems to be a little more of a conservative approach than package 7, but we end up in the same place. Can you tell me what factor you think is really driving that?
I think one of the things might be this slide here. So the simple versus the compound, if you look 10 years out, there's not a significant difference in the member's benefit. So for the simple COLA was 11,631 and they're 11,751. So I think that's one of the things that the lower the COLA percentage, the less difference you're going to see with simple versus compound. I'm also trying to see the different, so package 7, if you look at the FAC period, that only affected non-vested and new hires, the 5-year period. But on package 2, that affected all active members. So package 2 covered a bigger proportion of our membership with respect to the FAC period. So that goes the opposite direction. Package 2 is more savings in that respect than package 7. Package 2 has a little bit less savings on the member contribution rate because that has the 8-year phase-in versus the 4-year phase-in on package 7. So package 7 is a little bit more savings in that respect. Package 7 also has a little bit more savings on the COLA provision because of the simple versus the compound, but as we saw on that one slide, it's not that big of a significant difference. Hopefully I answered your question, Mr. Dunphy.
Yes, sir, and I guess I'm concerned about the FAC period affecting all members under package 2 gives me a little concern, and I guess that's maybe why I'm leaning towards package 7. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Not overly. The one thing I'll mention on package 2 is the closer you are to retirement, the less effect that has. So for example, if I retire, let's say the day after the benefit change goes into effect or a month after, basically I'm retiring under a 3-year FAC period because that's going to be the FAC that's higher. To the extent that pay increases aren't as high as what might otherwise would be in normal circumstances, you might not get that big of a difference between 3-year and 5-year FAC calculation. So that's also something else to take into consideration. But as I mentioned before, there is no right or wrong answer with respect to which groups should or should not be covered by any of these provisions.
Okay, just to let the board know, when I was reviewing these before the meeting the last couple of days, I was leaning towards packages 2 and 7 as well, and just looking at the differences, even though we end up at the same number, I would just wanted to see if Mr. Drazloff thought that there might be one over the other that he would prefer. I know you're not here to advise us, but
I don't have preference on any package. I can give some thoughts that the board may want to consider. The only other thing that I would mention with package 7 is you're going to have a population that is covered under a compound COLA. And then you're going to have a population that's covered under a simple COLA. And that might be very challenging to explain if you had 2 retirees talking to each other and one saying, well, wait a minute, why is your COLA higher than mine? We got the same percentage. And it's just because of the application of compound versus simple. Just a communication challenge, but obviously that can be overcome. And I think administratively, the administration system for APERS is set up for a compound COLA. Now, obviously, things could be adjusted for a simple COLA, but that might be one other consideration for the board.
Thank you, sir.
Madam Chairman, this is Larry Walther. May I ask a question of David? David, whenever you look at package 7, and there's an amount that it affects the unfunded liability, and it's $57.2 million, is that an annual number, and does it change annually? Tell me a little more about that number, because it's curious that the same result between 2 and 7 in ultimately affecting the unfunded liability to 80%.
I think the slide, Mr. Walther, that you're referring to is showing on the screen.
16, slide 16 is what I'm looking at.
Yeah. So that is a one-time reduction in the unfunded accrued liability. So column C on that slide 16, would be what the reduction in the unfunded accrued liability would have been if these packages were in place June 30th, 2019. So instead of our unfunded being 2.39 billion, it would have been 2.39 billion less the amount you see in column C.
Correct. But that number, the next year and subsequent years would change, and apparently would change significantly over time in order to get the unfunded liability to 80%, or to maintain it where it is.
Well, the things that happen, if we're now talking about the projections, the reason that the unfunded gets affected beyond that period, is the fact that members are being covered under those new provisions. We're getting more member contributions coming into the system. So remember, the other component, one of the things we talk about is what we call the normal cost. And that's the cost of our active members accruing an additional year of service credit. And that's where we get the savings. We don't, if the employer contribution rate stayed at 15.32%, we would not need as much contributions to cover the cost of our active members accruing an additional year of service credit, and therefore that can go help to finance the unfunded accrued liability. In addition, the additional member contributions that are coming into the system are helping to help finance that unfunded accrued liability.
Okay, well, from my standpoint, obviously I think we need to make some move in the right direction to start to turn around this reduction. Well, I guess the increase in the unfunded liability that we've experienced over the last 20 years. And I know we can't do it over time. So I'm encouraged by this discussion. I guess for the meantime, or at this point in time, package 2 does seem to be attractive to me also, and just would, I guess my question from the point of view of the stakeholders, is it also maybe the most agreeable, or one that would be most acceptable to the different groups that we've talked about, the cities, the counties, and the employee association? And that, I guess that's for the chairman or any of the other members of the board that would like to address that.
Yeah, I would comment on that. I would think that it would be in our best interest to have another special meeting in July and define exactly what we're going to be looking at, and allowing the associations to vet that back through their membership, their boards, so we're all clear. And also, I like the idea of a resolution format that states the facts and then states the policies like has been drafted in kind of broad terms. And that could be put together and that all could be that could be sent out to everybody concerned, and then we could have this special meeting and see if we can come to some kind of conclusion.
Madam Chairman, this is Daryl Bassett.
Carol, go ahead.
I concur with the judge, but with this addition, I think we should probably try to narrow this down somewhat. We've got numerous packages here. I think we should try to narrow it down to maybe 3 packages, 4 packages. I'm not set on a number, but I think we should probably try to narrow this down before we have another meeting, because I just don't want to have another meeting with all of the packages on the table. I think we should probably try to narrow this down. I hear a lot of talk about package 2. I hear talk about 7. I just think we should. Everyone's reviewed these packages. We all know what's in these packages. I just think if we could narrow them down to maybe 3 or 4 packages, then our next meeting could be a little more precise, where we're not shooting with a shotgun, we're shooting with a rifle. That would be my take.
I agree with that, and that was, if I didn't say that, that would be the intent. I think there might be some common ground on package 2. If package 7, it allows for more definition of the hold harmless provision, how the different provisions would be impacted or be implemented, the implementation language. You could set it out in a much more clear format, and not only for the board's information and to clarify the impact on our unfunded accrued actuarial liability, but the other impacts. So not only for the board's benefit, but for the association's benefit. If you read those letters, they can more specifically assess the support that's out there whenever the proposals are more narrowly defined and communicated in a more clear fashion. So that's what I'm hoping. And 2 or 3 packages. If number 2 is it, if number 7 with, I think there was some clarification on that. Maybe those are 2 and 7's enough. Let's have the schedule. Find a time in July that's agreeable to the board. Have more details on a narrow approach, and see if we can come to a conclusion. That also allows those associations to give some feedback.
Madam Chair, why are we married to the packages? Why couldn't we pick and choose from the different packages what we like and create a new package? It appears like we're agreeing on some basic things. So why wouldn't we just, make up the package now that we've read all the different packages that we kind of agree on? Because it appears our agreement is based on the effect it has on 2 things, our system, each thing has on our system, as well as on state employees. I've just thrown that out there. I think we could, based on the discussion, we could probably come up with a package that has all the elements in it. But I didn't know we were going to be married to a package and we had to vote on one package or the other. I thought it was still individual items in the package that we were interested in.
Yeah, and I don't know that we are married to a package, Andrea. I think that we have packages that we ask to be proposed, and I think that certainly is an option for all of us. It appears from what the discussion is at this point is that gravitating toward package 2 and 7 and items are in those particular packages. And if we could focus more closely on those areas of those packages that maybe we like, or maybe if we would like to propose going forward with those 2 packages, and then maybe adding a third with a combination of areas in those packages that we seem to like to put together for a 3rd package, and maybe come back in July and get our intake from our stakeholders. Maybe that's an option that we would have going forward, and we could cut these packages down. So
I think that's an excellent suggestion. It does seem like 2 and 7, and then maybe the 3rd one could be a combination of those. I think that's an excellent suggestion.
I agree. I think that's where we're going. I'm not married. This is Daryl, Madam Chairman. I'm not married to a particular package, but I think the components of those packages seem to be components that most of the board are at least concerned about, and I think should probably move forward. And so, yeah, I'm not tied to any particular package, but the components of the package. And I think, given the testimonies that we've had today, I think those 2 packages probably address the concerns that we've had both from counties and the other presenters today that give us some food for thought. So I'm not tied to any particular package, but I think we need to narrow this focus down for the next meeting so that we're not all over the board in the next meeting, that the components within those 2 packages are those components that I think should comprise the bulk of our conversation. That's my point.
Madam Chair.
Jason, go ahead.
May I make a motion that the board forward package 2 and package 7 to a special meeting in July for further consideration that would also give Municipal League and AAC and State Employees Association an opportunity to do a deeper dive and also give comment on, and that would be my motion, and I am open for a friendly amendment.
I'll second that motion.
I have a motion and a second. Any discussion?
This is Larry Walther. I'd like to make a comment.
Yes, go ahead.
And I'm not sure where package 7 came from. I mean, that sort of kind of came out of the blue here at the end, and that wasn't even one that I had on my radar screen. Having said that, package 2 is a kind of a basic framework. And is it possible that between now and then that we also ask for a 3rd and make some modifications if we think they need to be modified? There are modifications that the board would like to see the impact of, like on package 2. I think we like the 7, and we like the 7% and the 8-year phase in. There might be a question on the 5-year active employees because of the legality of it. I think that we addressed that when David said that it's the higher of the 3 or the 5. And then the 8 years, I think Mr. Brady suggested 7 years.
Yes,
would we want to look at 7 years? I don't know. And the compounding, the COLA, I think the COLA seems to be acceptable because it's only for new hires, as I understand it. So I just throw that out as if we want to make some progress and maybe and get to a resolution at the next called meeting, we might want to think about an additional or an iteration of some of these things we've talked about today. I throw that out as I guess more of a question.
Which is kind of what I just said a few minutes ago.
Yes, right. And I think that's correct. I think that we have Jason's motion on and a second on package 2 and 7, but I think that maybe if you're willing, we could amend that and include maybe motion that would include a third package that we have a
Madam-
combination of those areas for that third package.
Madam Chair, may I amend my original motion to add a third package that follows Secretary Walters' recommendation?
And I'll change my second to agree with that. And I would suggest that maybe Duncan work with the board to flesh that out so we would have some specifics so they can define that and run the numbers on it after this meeting's over, unless we're going to clear that up before the end of the meeting.
And we can absolutely do that. And
I think we probably need in the meeting, don't we, on what we want in the third package we're considering in this motion, correct?
Well, no, Madam Chairman, I would say that if we're going to amend the original motion, then if we're looking at package 2 and package 7, I concur with Secretary Walter that there probably needs to be some type of an assimilation between those two. And I would concur that, yes, let's create a merging of the two, and then we've got a third package. Whatever that third package would be, that would require the board members, the various board members, whoever want to create some kind of semblance between 2 and 7 to create that package 3. And then we could consider then the package 2, package 7, and the alternative package that's been created. I would concur that we should probably consider those 3 packages in the next meeting.
One possible thing, thinking about the vesting, it sounds like no matter what we choose there, it probably has a minimal impact. So, if we look at package 2 as a framework, and it sounds like there's general agreement on the member contribution rate and maybe on the COLA provision, I almost wonder if you use package 2 as a framework and then maybe just look at an alternative package, leave the vesting off of there, but just look at the FAC covering all actives, look at an option with the FAC covering new members, and just consider the vesting as a separate question, since it appears to have a minimal impact from a financial standpoint. Mita, I don't know if you might have any comments on that, just the logic behind that.
Yeah, with package 2, you're exactly correct, Duncan. If you were to change package 2, just the vesting period, you could choose anywhere between 5 and 10 years, and it's not going to affect the results. The reason being, and this is what I was trying to articulate before, is the increase to the 7% member contribution rate sort of neutralizes that. So I don't think you're going to see different results between the 8 and the 10 years. If you alter the package 2 FAC period to switch it from all actives to a version of package 7 non-vested and new hires, I do think you're going to see a significant change in that reduction of the unfunded accrued liability of the 125 million. Because I think the place you're getting that, because remember that there's no change in the unfunded because of the member contribution rate change. There's no change because of the vesting. And the COLA provision is new hires only. Then you're going to be changing that reduction in the unfunded accrued liability for package 2. Remember the 57 million for package 7 comes from basically the non-vested portions of the 5 years, the 10-year vesting, not much from the 10-year vesting, but the minimum 3% CPI is simple. It's not just new hires, that affected non-vested members as well. So just items for consideration there. If package 2, if you eliminate that FAC for all actives, you're going to reduce the reduction in the unfunded, I think, pretty significantly.
So I was just thinking, just for purposes of getting packages down on paper, that I was just thinking if we take that one variable out, still consider that variable of vesting, but that would make it so that we don't have to do a 5-year actives with 8-year vesting, 5-year actives with 7, 5-year new hires with 8, with 7, with 10. We can almost just consider the vesting question separate and maybe
Right.
just have a couple of scenarios based off of package 2 plus package 7, if there's some general agreement on the other components of that.
Yeah, I
If-
think
if
the
that
best
makes
the vesting period could then just get discussed at the July meeting, whatever vesting period the board feels comfortable with, because I don't think it will change
So-
the numbers.
So are you suggesting that we bifurcate the simple versus compound vesting, non-vested versus new non-vested, and new hires, simple non-vested, and new hires with the compound new hires only? So we're going to bifurcate that particular issue and discuss that separately? Is that what you're suggesting?
No, I was just thinking for the purpose of package 2, you know, if we're looking at doing some variations of that, I was just thinking we don't necessarily have to look at a specific package that has a 10-year vesting, 8-year vesting, 7-year vesting, 5-year vesting with all these other components rotating, because the vesting appears to not have any or either minimal financial impact. I just thought, you know, if you just kind of have that as a separate conversation, then that might simplify the process of coming up with an alternative package. But I may have complicated matters by throwing that out there, which is not what I intended to do. So.
No, I don't. I think that makes sense to me. I don't know if it makes sense to the other board members, but yeah, Mr. Beard, that makes sense to me. I don't know how the other board members feel about that, but that makes sense to me.
Duncan, the main thing that I would like to have is when we meet the next time that if we make some changes, or if we want to consider some changes, we understand what the impact of those changes would be. And so, and when I made the description earlier, it was the 2 or 3 things that seemed to be maybe a little in question when you put it in light of the letters we got from the three groups.
Okay.
Madam Chairman, this is Gary.
Yes, Gary, go ahead.
On the matter of the vesting period, I think Jason Brady's comment about the 7 years was very insightful. So it seems to me that just as I said, the 8 years is kind of a compromised position. I think the 7 years is a very good number that we could probably all agree on, especially since we're hearing that it doesn't affect the finances very much. On the matter of the COLA, simple, and I think I'm correct in what I'm getting ready to say here, and looking at all these different options, the thing that makes a difference is whether on new hire, I'm just talking about new hires now, is whether you have a 3% compound or the CPI or 3%. The question about the simple compound, the simple increase, 3% simple versus 3% compound, makes no significant change in the numbers. So that discussion about 3% simple, in my opinion, is not really worth going there. It doesn't affect the numbers significantly. The only thing we need to discuss is whether on new hires, we're going to convert them over to the CPI or 3% compound. That's my perspective on it. Thank you.
Could you weigh in on that, Mita? Because I think it does make a significant difference. But I could, the compound versus simple.
Yeah, I might have said it a little bit differently. I do think the lesser of the 3% or CPI is the more significant of the 2 changes. Simple versus compound does have, there is some significance there, but we go back to this slide. So if you look at just over the 10-year period, if you look at the difference between the compound and the lesser of 3% or CPI, for this hypothetical member, their benefit under the compound provision gets reduced from 13,439 to 11,751. That's a pretty significant reduction. But if you look at the change then from that 11,751 to the simple, it only goes down another $120. So the 11,751 to the 11,631. So that is significant. That's not to say it is, but it is definitely less significant than the change going from a straight 3% to the lesser of 3% or CPI.
I need a clarification. Can I get a clarification? On number 7, package 7, what is the COLA that applies to current employees when they retire? And what would apply to non-vested and new hires with regard to the COLA?
So package 7, if we go back to this slide here, basically for any individual who's vested or currently retired, they get the 3% compound COLA. For any individual who is non-vested or new hire, they would get the far right-hand column. So it would be the lesser of 3% or the change in the CPI, but it would be based on a simple COLA as opposed to a compound.
All right, tell me again, what would a current employee who is vested get when he retires?
Well, if they retired with a $10,000 monthly benefit, they would get a 3% compound COLA.
Compound.
Compound, yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
And that was Mr. Walther, that was one of my points I was trying to articulate earlier, is if package 7 is adopted, you're going to have a portion of the membership covered under a compound COLA and a portion of the membership that's covered under a simple COLA. Now, obviously, you're also going to have different COLA percentages, but you're going to have that communication issue as well.
Which portion would be under a simple COLA? Those who are not vested?
Non-vested and new hires.
Okay, all right. That will probably be objectionable to the Employees Association, the counties and the cities.
I agree.
And I think there would be some complexity to administer that as well when you think about the logic built into the system around a compound COLA. You know, I think there is likely that there would be some complexity to split the population and then have different logic for the new population.
Madam Chairman, Daryl Bassett, there was a mention of a $10,000 monthly benefit. How does that apply to the average APERS retiree? How many of them are getting a $10,000 a month benefit? I mean, perhaps I misunderstood that statement that was just made a couple minutes ago. Let's put that in context. How do we put that in context?
Mr. Bassett, the only reason we used a $10,000 benefit is just it was a nice round number. It wasn't meant to represent the average benefit of an APERS retiree. It just allowed, in the one slide where we were trying to show the application of the COLA, which was our slide 11, it was just a nice round number so that you can see, well, 10,000, if the 3% simple COLA, you just see the benefit increasing by $300. So it was just,
right.
It was never meant to convey what an average APERS retiree is receiving right now. It was just meant to be an example retiree to show the application of the COLA.
I understand, but see, and that's why I brought it to the attention of the board, because I want the numbers to be applicable to our average and our mean salaries that our people are making. And $10,000 monthly benefit seems to be far beyond what would be the average or the mean benefit for APERS employees. And I think the board needs to take that into consideration.
And I might have misspoke earlier. The 10,000 in our slide could be monthly, it could be annual. It's just a $10,000 benefit. And if I misspoke earlier when I said a monthly benefit, then I misspoke.
Right. Well, you said monthly, so that was a concern to me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Madam Chair, this is Jason. May I?
Yes, Jason, go ahead.
I am either happy to withdraw my amended motion so that we can have a cleaner one after further discussion. My main target or focus was to focus the conversation. So again, I just want to reemphasize that I'm happy to withdraw that if we don't feel like that motion's helping us get to a final sort of package for a July meeting.
And to that end, I'll withdraw a second. I think we're just wanting to bring this to a conclusion.
Thank you, Judge.
Well, I think.
Thank you. Does anybody else have a suggested motion that they would like to put forward?
I just think that Mr. Brady should perhaps modify his initial motion. I agree with the motion. I agree with the second. I think we need to streamline what the board is going to be talking about next session into perhaps 2, maybe 3 discussion areas. I just think we need to, today is a starting point, but I think we have large agreement on at least 2 areas, and hearkening back to some of the comments that Secretary Walters said. I don't see why we can't look at least 2 of the packages, not being tied to any of the provisions of the package, but the components of the package, and then have some type of alternative out there as a third area that aggregates those 2 packages into something that we can at least have a discussion about. I just don't think that it's going to be fruitful for us to come back into the next meeting and have 11 packages that we're talking about once again. I think this meeting, at the end of the day, we should be able to kind of aggregate those and come down to at least 2 or 3.
Madam Chair, I have a motion.
Yes, please, go ahead.
I move that we take package 2, package 7, and request that the executive director get with ERS and come up with an amalgam for a 3rd package based on the discussion today, and bring it back to us at a July special called meeting.
I will second that motion, please, Madam Chair.
I have a motion and a second. Do I have any discussion on the motion and the second? Hearing none, I have a motion and a second. All in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Thank you very much. The motion carries. And Duncan, you understand what the motion is, and we'll look to you to create conglomeration of the 2 packages then, based on the discussion.
Absolutely. I'll work with GRS on that, and I'll also reach out to y'all to figure out a good date that will work for everyone in July and coordinate with the board on that.
Great. I think that would be great, and if we can come up with that proposal generally sooner rather than later, and send it out to our stakeholders to get any comments from them at our July meeting, I think that would be very appropriate. Duncan, do you have anything else do you want to add for this meeting?
That is everything I have today. I think we've made tremendous progress from where we started many months ago, and yeah, I think we've made a lot of progress and look forward to the July meeting.
Right. Thank you, everyone. I think we've had a great discussion this morning, and really thank you, GRS, for your presentation. That's been very, very helpful to all of us through this process. And we will look forward to having a special meeting to consider our three other proposals in July and listening to our stakeholders. And our next regular meeting is scheduled for August the 19th at 9 a.m. And with that, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
I have a motion and second. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
And good day. We're adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Okay, bye.